Well, hello, coaches. Welcome back. Coach KW here. Second video in this 9v9 series. If you missed my first video in 9v9, basically what I did is I did a survey of a whole bunch of different 9v9 formations, pretty common ones out there, ways to play it, more importantly, ways not to play them. But I said at the end of that video, I was going to spend a little extra attention on 2/3 that we ended up using and I find extremely useful on the field. I had my first team doing 9v9 this year in the fall, and we started with one in a transitional moment, and after 4 games or so, we switched to another. But importantly, when we switched to the second one, we made some changes as we looked at what was happening for some of our other teams in my town that were playing the same formation. And we had come up this year with our first real concrete 9v9 principles of play, and we gave the coaches 2 options. So you'll see what those 2 options are, and you'll see how we changed the second option, the one that we moved to for my team, halfway through the year because we got feedback, and also based on just observations. We watch video of our games, especially games that my team plays, because I record them all, but I also talk to other coaches. And so it's really important as coaches to get together and kind of talk about what's working and not working so that we can get better for our kids, right? So let's take a look at the first transitional formation that we used and how it worked for us. And then as we go along, I'll kind of get through this whole process of what we think the best formation is, and hint, there isn't one. It's more of a system of play. And that's, if anything, you get from the end of this video. I hope that by the time you get to the end of this, that you will understand that it's not about the numbers on the page, but it's how you define the setup of the players and what you do with and without the ball that's the most important when you're coming up with a system of play. So let's take a look at this first one now. Okay, here we are back at the whiteboard. Hopefully you recognize our beloved 1-2-3-1 from 7v7 soccer. And when it comes to 7v7, I'm sorry, you can argue with me all day long. I believe this is the one and only formation you should be playing because it teaches so many different things. You can go back and watch a bunch of other videos on that if you want to argue with me in the comments. You can't convince me, I'm sorry. However, when we move to 9v9, especially if you don't have a lot of time in a preseason, or like in my case, I had to run preseason for all the 5th grade boys in my town, so I didn't have my team specifically. One of the options that you could do with this is to simply take the new 2 defenders and drop them in behind your existing defenders in 7v7, and now you have basically a 2-2-3-1. And the reason why we suggested this to our teams was it's pretty natural. When you don't have these 2 players in 7v7, these 2 players naturally moved with the play in the back. And that's exactly what we want them to do as midfielders in this formation. And now we've got 2 center backs behind them that we're going to do the same thing. So what this introduced in a kind of sneaky way was the double pivot. These 2 players became the double pivot as the ball was on this side of the field and the players slid over just like they would in 7v7. What you'd end up with was this strong defensive back 3 with this player standing a little bit in front of them while you had your width and your play went along as your kids were used to. And when the ball moved to this side of the field, these players naturally in 7v7 would do this motion, the double pivot. These center backs would do the same thing that they were used to doing at 7v7. They're just behind this line. Same thing, back 3, support around the ball with all that. And that was very successful for my team and a few others who tried this because it was familiar. If the team played 7v7 in grades 3 and 4 and they stepped onto the field, it was a fairly easy transition for them to move from point A to point B with this formation. You can see it here in this graphic. It's pretty straightforward, right? You've basically dropped that 4 and 5 behind what used to be your 4 and 5s. Now you call those 2 players 6s because they're holding midfielders. You've got that central midfielder, that 8, and then you've got your 7, 11, and your 9 all around it. So it kind of looks like a big giant star. And again, super familiar with the kids. They definitely can really plug into this if you've played your 2-3-1 successfully in U10 soccer. And it's a great transitional moment. What we didn't love about this formation was that many times the first pivot would happen. The 2 6s would slide over, one would go towards the ball, one would drop back. What began to happen, especially as you got closer to the goal that you were attacking, is that when the ball went to the other side, the pivot didn't happen. Yeah, I'll show you here just as an example. So as the ball might progress its way to this way, we'd get the pivot coming across like this. So now this player was in alignment with the back two to make this. So here are the two attackers from the opposing team kind of hanging out near the halfway line as the play's on here. If the ball would switch around, what would happen is instead of the pivot happening like this player would just kind of go like this. And the next thing you know, your field started to kind of look like this. And it did two different things. It made it really difficult to get through this basically block of sometimes 4, 5, 6 players. And also it left these players kind of hanging out here 1v1 with these two strikers because now this pivot had gone too far. So if the ball turned over and it was just booted up, now it's a foot race. And now it's 2v2 in the back with no real support, which is it's not ideal. It's not what you want in a defensive situation. You always want to have one extra player if you can for that cover. When we look at a few clips here, you can see if it wasn't for the speed and the ability of some of the kids that I had on my team being good players in the back, there are a number of times where they could have been one-on-one towards goal, towards my keeper, and all they had to do was beat one person. And so we knew that, but when we started to play better teams, this could be a liability. And so we thought, perhaps we need to change. Much of the time, our players did a great job with this, with the pivot. But as the ball got here and as games went along, we saw more and more this crowding across the top of the box, no depth to the attack. And one of the worst things you could have is have this separation between your lines. Is my defensive line, my midfield line is gone and everybody's on the front. Having that disconnect between the lines can spell real danger because it gives lots of space for the opposition team to get balls into, especially on the counterattack. So what did we do? Well, the other formation we told our coaches that could be usable for them was the 3-2-3. And I'll show this to you right now. Here's the diagram for the 3-2-3. It's pretty simple to understand. What was interesting for us, and I'll show you on the whiteboard in a second, is the instructions we gave to our coaches. We were very much focused before the season started about that midfield triangle. And one of the reasons for that, and having that double pivot as be the central tenet of what we're doing, is what our town does at 11v11. We play a 4-2-3-1, and that 2 in front of the back line of 4 is the double pivot. And we were focused on how can we train those kids to be ready for that as time went forward. So that midfield triangle of the 3, we approached a little bit differently. I'll show you on the whiteboard. So here we have the 3-2-3 in the attacking phase. So we're going this way, right? And so we were so focused on this triangle maintaining to be intact with the double pivot sliding around to attack and also providing a back 4 almost, a screener in front. That our instructions to our coaches was to treat this 9 as basically a false 9 without actually calling it out, to maintain that triangle so that they were withdrawn from going forward. And then we instructed play to look for diagonal runs in from the wide areas, playing balls in as the primary mean of attack. And while that is a sound principle, especially if you're looking to be defensively responsible, maybe it's late in the game, whatever else, the struggles were twofold. One was just having your players have the discipline to do that and make those passes in. But perhaps the more practical reason is if you tell a kid that they're the striker, they're the 9, 5th and 6th grade boy or girl, they have one idea and one idea only. And that is they want to get towards the goal as fast as they can because their job is to score goals, right? Nobody wants to be, a Philip Coutinho from Liverpool playing in here. Everybody wants to be the Erling Haaland of Man City going straight towards the goal. That's what a number 9, a striker, does. And so our coaches had some difficulty getting our players, honestly, naturally, to follow those instructions. So what we did is we took a look at that feedback as well as looked at some of the videos of what we were seeing against teams we were playing when it came time to try it with our team. So here's that 3-2-3 in that sort of generic form that you would see all over the place that we talked about. This isn't how we decided to attack. What we did was this. So what we did was this. We took that center, quote unquote, center back, and we turned them into a 6. And when we did that, we basically said to them, when we have the ball, you're going to step forward from the 2 center backs. So now that relationship is very much like it was in 7v7 with the 2 center backs and the 8, We're now just calling this player a 6 because it's a bigger field and they're not getting as far forward. They're more defensive minded. We've now taken the importance away from the triangle we had, which was the 9 and the 2 8s in front of them, and we flipped it on its head. So if we flip back to this, we were really focused on the 2 8s and the 9 being that triangle and the double pivot being there. And what we've done instead is we've flipped it around, and now the important triangle is the 6 and the 2 8s in front of it. So now what we've done is we've pushed those players forward a little bit, we've spread them out, we maintain our width. We have our 9, who's a true striker up ahead. Those 2 8s now fill in on either side to give ourselves lots of width. We have this really strong diamond in the middle between the striker, the 2 8s, and the 6. We still have a really strong triangle in the back for defense. But when we have the ball, we now have a ton of options. Look at all the angles of support that happen between this formation. There's lots of places that players can go. We'll take a look at the whiteboard in a second, what we also did with it. But we simply just flip that triangle around in the middle between the focus being the 9 and the 2 8s to now being the 6 and the 2 8s. And the other thing this did is it makes that 6 kind of like the quarterback of the team. Every team has a couple of players that just have that ability to see the field, have a knack for receiving the ball, knowing where the danger is, playing passes. This is tailor-made for a player like this. It really, really helps develop a player like that, which is super important as you go up. And what we found is because we had somebody back there, we had so many options. As we look at some of these video clips, you can see how that kind of just changed the shape of the attack and gave us so much width and depth. We were no longer piling up on top of the 18. We kept that shape. We were wider and deeper, which forced other teams to not just stand in a line across the top of the box. They had to come out, they had to spread out, and that gave us so much more opportunity to move the ball around and through. In this formation, because we shift around, if the ball is over on one side, even that center back that's in the back had lots of passes that came from the winger when they got in trouble. They were all part of the play. So we had lots of options to be able to move that ball around if we couldn't go forward and we needed to turn around. It just gave us that stability. Then when it was time to defend, it kind of morphed into a 3-4-1, which if you remember in that first video, I kind of mentioned briefly and said, we're going to come back to it. Because what this basically did was very much like the principles of defending that I have in 7v7, is that the wingers are just responsible for their wide wingers. So they basically play 1v1 the entire time out there. And if you look at the middle of the field, all the way to the striker, you've got a triangle that basically force play to one side or the other. So usually it was one winger that was involved in defending, while the other winger didn't have to track back as far. They kind of just kept an eye on their opposite winger to make sure they didn't sneak in on the backside. And more importantly, because we had all those numbers in the middle and we had forced the play to one side, when we won the ball, it was a very easy transition. So many times that wide opposite weak side winger or the striker would be wide open to receive a ball after we won it in the middle and could turn around and go away. The other piece when we were on the attack that was so important and was so evident is because we had so many numbers around the ball, because we were playing between our players in all these spaces, is that if we lost the ball, the counter press was incredibly effective. It clogged the middle. We had lots of players around the ball to try to attack that. If they made a pass or two, it ended up going outside, which is exactly where we wanted them anyways. And because of that shape, that wedge shape, it drove them into the sideline. It limited their ability to get the ball back into the middle because that's where the numbers were. And we could usually win that ball back and come back the other way. The other important piece that I wanted to show over here was if you go way back in some of my videos, you'll find my video on dividing up the field, ways for coaches to think about the field. You may not explain it necessarily to your players, but I feel it's an important concept for youth soccer coaches to get to understand because it drives so much of what the modern game does, especially in the attacking and defending sense. And that is, in this formation, the way that it gets shaped up is we end up with players in all 5 of the vertical channels. The wide channels, the center channel, and the 2 half spaces are occupied by those 2 8s. And those half spaces, as you do any research on any sort of soccer, those half spaces are so valuable because they're in between. That's the whole point of a half space. They're in between the space a fullback or a center back might take up in a defensive position, and it makes them make a choice. These center backs are around the striker. If a player comes into this half space, they have to make a decision. Am I coming out here? or am I staying with this player? And that's what you want, is you want them to be in two minds. You want them to have to decide this or that. And that's kind of the whole point of attacking soccer, right? Is getting them to think this or that. If they step out, it gives this player space to operate, or perhaps another player to step in. If they stay in, now this player has a free operation through that space. And having players move in and out of channels, into and out of the half space, does the same thing. Perhaps this player has a wide marker. They cut in and come this way, and this player overlaps and goes this way. This player, again, is stuck into having to make a choice. It's all about the simple tenets of attacking football. We've now made a 2v1 out of this situation and have to make this player make a very difficult choice. By maintaining that width, if this player all cheated over, it gave room for these players to come around the back, so that line across the top of the box didn't exist anymore. If we were playing centrally and they did kind of push into the middle, then we had all sorts of room to be able to play this ball out and get out into the wide areas and, again, stretch those teams out. So it really gave us sort of the best of all worlds when we had the ball, with this player really kind of providing that overview. They could get the ball back and find this player or this player, because this pass for a 9v9 player is not that difficult to do. Fifth or sixth grader can make that pass reasonably well in most conditions. So if they didn't play the short ball, they could get that ball out quickly and really unbalance a team pretty effectively. So I hope you found this video useful on a number of fronts. One, having the awareness as a coach to see something not working as well perhaps as it should and making corrections on the fly. Hopefully you've also come to the conclusion that a formation is just a starting point. It's just a set of numbers, but what's important is your principles of play. What do you do with and without the ball is what counts. Is this a 3-2-3? Is this a 3-4-1? Is this a 2-1-3-1? Is this a 2-5-1? It doesn't really matter. The point is you have a clear sense of what to do when you have the ball and what you want to do and what your players should do. And when you don't have the ball, the same things happen. But I think you'll see that, at least in the 9v9 game, if you can morph yourself into that last 3-2-3, whatever you want to call that, it really does give you that balance of attack and defense, so that when you go forward, you've got a strong presence, you have lots of players, and you can possess the ball, you can maintain possession, you can win it back. And when you lose the ball, you've got that strong solidity in the middle of the field to push play to the outside, keep play there with the numbers that you have in the shape, and have an outlet when you win the ball. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful. I have more 9v9 content that I want to put together and bring out there. So stay tuned, share, like, subscribe. It really helps. The channel has made a huge jump in the last month or so. Really thanks to all of you. We're getting close to that 1,000 subscriber limit that I'd love to celebrate. So until next time, thank you so much. We'll see you on the field. Bye for now.